What if one woman could unmake an entire military campaign without drawing a single blade, and do it so flawlessly that 12 seasoned generals never realized they were already defeated the moment they stepped into her fortress? That question haunted every chronicle that dared whisper her name, because the Iron Maiden understood something her enemies never imagined. Wars are not won by steel, but by perception, fear, and the fragility of the human mind. And that night, she weaponized all three, with surgical precision. They believed they were hunting a cornered ruler, a woman whose kingdom was collapsing under the weight of betrayal and approaching armies. But the truth is far darker. She had orchestrated their advance, fed their ego, and calculated every step they would take long before their boots touched her soil. While her castle appeared abandoned, its torches extinguished, its gates half broken, she was watching from the shadows, memorizing their faces, studying their rivalries, and deciding exactly which weakness to exploit first. For years, enemy commanders mocked her for earning the title Iron Maiden not through brute force, but through rituals, coded messages, and disappearances that left no bodies behind. They thought she relied on superstition. They mistook fear for legend, legend for myth. She knew better. She understood that men who underestimate a woman invite their own destruction, and on that single night, she transformed their arrogance into a labyrinth they would never escape. When the generals entered the stone hall, they expected a trap made of blades or poison. Instead, they found mirrors, tall, ancient mirrors etched with symbols none of them recognized. Candles flickered beside them, producing shadows that moved where no flame touched. The generals whispered theories, each trying to conceal rising unease. The Iron Maiden had studied their psychological profiles, their fears, their political fractures. She knew one was haunted by omens, another by guilt, another by ambitions so volatile it could be redirected with a nudge. Her strategy was not to kill them. It was to rearrange their reality. One by one, the generals began to believe they were seeing things that could not exist. A dead soldier walking behind a pillar, a sigil burning without fire, a whisper of their own name from behind a wall. Nothing touched them physically, yet each illusion hit exactly where their mind was weakest. Her traps were not metal, they were doubts. And doubts, once planted, grow roots faster than any spear can pierce. What none of them realized was that she was guiding their fear like a conductor guides a symphony. The room itself was designed to fracture their trust, forcing them to question one another instead of her. She had turned 12 men into 12 threats, each convinced the others were hiding something. And while they argued, she listened, collecting every confession they didn't mean to reveal. This was the true deception she made, then betray themselves long before the night was over. You ever felt the unsettling sense that someone planned your downfall before you even stepped into the room? You can already sense how deep this goes, and what you'll discover next may surprise you. If this story is hitting you the way it was meant to, leave a comment sharing your reaction so far, drop a like to help keep these forgotten histories alive, and check if you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part. Now let's move forward. Because what the Iron Maiden does after this moment is far more disturbing than the trap she used to draw them in. They thought the illusions inside that hall were her grand tactic, a final display of desperation from a ruler cornered by superior armies. But the Iron Maiden had never relied on desperation. She relied on design. And as the generals moved deeper into the fortress, still shaken by what they believed were hallucinations, she used their confusion to peel back the layers of who they truly were. Each man carried a hidden fracture long before setting foot inside her realm. She simply exposed it in a single night. What none of them knew was that she had been constructing this trap years before the siege even began. Informants embedded in merchant caravans, coded correspondence disguised as harmless trade agreements, whispers passed between courtesans and stable boys. She gathered every detail of their political ambitions, feuds, superstitions, and personal sins. To her, the generals were not 12 commanders. They were 12 open wounds waiting to be pressed. The fortress walls, with their carved symbols and shifting candlelight, were merely the stage she prepared to bring those wounds into the open. When the first pair of generals broke away from the group, arguing about whether the hall had shifted behind them, she made sure the door they chose led to the chamber she called the listening room. Inside, the acoustics were intentionally distorted, designed so any whisper was amplified, and any breath seemed like someone standing behind them. Their steps echoed in irregular rhythms, making each man suspect the other was hiding something. The Iron Maiden watched from a slit in the stone as one general finally confessed a betrayal he had sworn to take to his grave. His ally listened with growing horror, realizing that the man he trusted most had been ready to sacrifice him if the war turned. Meanwhile, the third and fourth generals entered a passage lined with iron rings and hooks, relics from a time when the fortress served as a prison. She had arranged the torches so their shadows appeared elongated and warped, giving the impression of phantom sentinels watching from the walls. They paused, trying to steady their breath, but the silence only amplified the pounding of their hearts. When a faint metallic clink echoed through the corridor, both men spun around, swords raised, each convinced the other had triggered a trap. But there was no trap, only a loose ring she had nudged earlier so it would shift at the right moment. The remaining generals, still attempting to keep a semblance of authority, tried to regroup in what looked like a war chamber. Maps were spread across the table, but each map told a different story. Troop movements that contradicted their own intelligence reports, alliances they believed were stable now marked as broken, and symbols drawn in crimson ink where strategic strongholds once stood. They assumed the maps were forged to mislead them. In truth, the Iron Maiden used only real intelligence, reports she had intercepted, facts she had confirmed, and betrayals that had occurred days earlier. The shock came not from lies, but from truth delivered at the most destabilizing moment possible. She understood that people crumble faster when confronted with realities they are not prepared to face. And as each general tried to interpret the maps, they began accusing one another of concealing the shifting loyalties of their allies. They didn't realize that she had arranged the maps in a pattern that subtly reinforced their personal fears. The paranoid general found evidence confirming his suspicions. The ambitious one saw opportunities slipping from his grasp, and the cautious one saw threats forming too quickly to counter. She wasn't just misleading them, she was making them see the world through their darkest expectations. By the time they attempted to regroup once more, every man was already making silent calculations about survival. They entered her fortress as a unified command, but now they moved like 12 isolated figures navigating their own private nightmares. And the Iron Maiden, walking silently behind hidden walls, knew that the most dangerous part of her strategy had not even begun. What she needed now was to turn their fractured trust into irreversible division, and the next chamber they entered would ensure they crossed a line from which none of them could return. By the time the generals reached the inner courtyard, the night had shifted in a way none of them recognized. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker, as if the fortress itself were holding its breath. They didn't know that the Iron Maiden had engineered this space with the precision of a strategist and the intuition of someone who understood the weaknesses of men far better than they understood themselves. This courtyard, with its cracked stones and extinguished braziers, was not a passage. It was a magnifying glass for fear. The moment they stepped onto the uneven ground, torches flared to life along the upper walls as if ignited by an invisible hand. The generals flinched, each pretending he hadn't. The truth was simpler. None of the 12 had ever walked into a battlefield where the enemy's weapon was not steel or fire, but the erosion of certainty itself. She had crafted this moment to force every man to confront the truth he feared most, that he was not in control. From her vantage point behind a carved lattice, she watched the group splinter yet again. One general knelt to examine footprints in the dust, convinced they belonged to scouts she had hidden in the shadows. Another stared upward, searching for archers on the battlements. A third scanned the ground for tripwires. These were men who had survived dozens of campaigns, yet now every detail felt sinister, every sound like a warning. She had stripped away their confidence without touching a single sword. The courtyard contained a stone well at its center, its rope frayed, its bucket missing. The generals approached it cautiously, drawn by the faint sound echoing from below, something that might have been water or might have been a whisper. What none of them knew was that she had placed a thin metal disc deep inside, angled to catch echoes in a way that made them seem like distant voices rising from the earth. Each man heard something different, an accusation, a confession, a name spoken, with dread. Their reactions told her exactly what she wanted to know: who feared guilt, who feared betrayal, and who feared being forgotten. One general leaned over the well too far, and another yanked him back, cursing him for being reckless. The fragile unity they had clung to since entering the fortress finally snapped. Voices rose, hands hovered near hilts, and old resentments surfaced like rot beneath polished armor. She had spent years ensuring this night would bring every fault line to the surface. As they argued, she took note of who chose sides, who remained silent, and who tried, poorly, to mask his panic. Just as their argument reached its peak, a gust of wind swept through the courtyard, and with it came the metallic clang of a distant gate slamming shut. They froze. None of them had touched a gate. None of them had moved beyond the courtyard. But something inside the fortress had closed itself to them. In truth, she had simply released a counterweight she prepared that afternoon, but to the generals the noise signaled a shift from entrapment to entombment. She knew the psychological effect would be immediate. Men who believed they were hunters now felt hunted. Men who came to corner a queen now sensed they were being funneled step by step toward an end they could no longer predict. The courtyard walls, illuminated by flickering torchlight, cast distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. One general insisted he saw figures watching from the far archway. Another claimed the ground vibrated beneath his boots. Each illusion came solely from their unraveling minds. Their fear was her compass. She followed it carefully, silently retreating into the next chamber, ensuring they would follow the path she intended. But before they reached her next design, they would face the element she prized most: anticipation. The dread not of what is seen, but of what is expected. She understood that the deepest terror is born not from violence, but from being forced to imagine what might come next. And as the generals pushed open the heavy door at the far end of the courtyard, each man felt a shiver crawl up his spine. For they were stepping into the heart of her strategy, the place where their fractured trust would finally turn inward, until all that remained between them was suspicion sharp enough to draw blood. She was waiting for them, not to strike, but to press the final pressure point that would ensure they never again walked as allies. The chamber they entered was unlike any battlefield they had faced. The Iron Maiden had transformed a simple hall into a psychological labyrinth, a space where every sound, every shadow, and every reflection worked against the 12 generals. The walls were lined with dark tapestries embroidered with symbols that none of them recognized, twisting in candlelight to suggest movement where there was none. The floor, uneven and slick, reflected their distorted silhouettes, multiplying their presence until each man seemed surrounded by dozens of versions of himself, vulnerable, uncertain, and exposed. She had positioned objects with meticulous precision, scattered coins that clinked underfoot, subtly shifting with the wind, hanging chains that swayed just enough to appear alive, and mirrors angled to capture faint, flickering candlelight so it would suggest figures moving where there were none. Every detail had been calculated to provoke doubt, anxiety, and mistrust. The generals had entered with confidence, but in this room, the Iron Maiden turned perception into the deadliest weapon of all. One general, the youngest and most ambitious, found himself pacing in a corner, convinced a shadow in the far wall was an assassin sent to end him before the night was over. Another, already suspicious of his closest allies, believed he had glimpsed a whisper of movement behind the curtain, confirming his deepest fears that one of his companions had already betrayed him. Every creak of the stone floor, every faint groan of the fortress amplified the uncertainty, twisting their reasoning and inflaming their tempers. Arguments erupted spontaneously, sharp words exchanged, and alliances that had held firm outside this hall began to fracture with alarming speed. The Iron Maiden observed from a hidden alcove, her presence unseen, yet profoundly felt. She had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a master strategist, allowing them to debate, accuse, and suspect each other until their cohesion dissolved into a haze of paranoia. No weapons had been drawn, yet she had already disarmed them completely. Her trap was psychological, predicated on fear and doubt rather than violence. Yet its power was absolute. Every misstep, every hesitation, every whispered accusation worked to her advantage. She introduced her final layer of tension through subtle auditory cues. A faint scraping behind a door, a distant metallic clang, the whisper of a footstep, each sound carefully timed to exploit their already heightened anxiety. The generals were unraveling, their focus pulled in multiple directions, their minds forced to interpret every innocuous noise as a threat. And in this chaos, she delivered her most effective weapon, the awareness that the enemy was not outside, but among them. Every shadow could be a spy, every reflection a traitor, and every footfall a signal that their survival was already compromised. By the time the night had deepened, they were no longer 12 generals acting as a unit. They were 12 fractured minds, each preoccupied with self-preservation, each uncertain whom to trust. And while they bickered, argued, and whispered suspicions, the Iron Maiden silently catalogued every weakness, every fear, and every secret that had been exposed. She knew exactly how to exploit them in the coming hours. She had set the stage not for bloodshed, but for complete dominance of the mind. Now, the generals were on the brink of their ultimate collapse. They believed they were still in command, yet in truth, they had already walked into her design, each step playing into her strategy. And here, as the tension reached its zenith, you have to wonder, what would you do if every trusted ally suddenly seemed a threat, and the room you were in seemed alive with unseen eyes? If this story is gripping you so far, leave a comment sharing what you think the generals felt in this moment, because understanding their fear is the key to understanding the Iron Maiden. The generals barely had a moment to recover from the chamber's illusions before they were led into the inner gallery, a narrow corridor lined with statues whose faces seemed to twist as candlelight danced across their stone features. The Iron Maiden had designed this passage to heighten disorientation. Every statue cast shadows that stretched unnaturally, creating the impression of moving figures that flanked them on either side. The general's steps were cautious, now deliberate, yet each hesitant movement only reinforced the sense that the walls themselves were closing in, observing their every decision. Her mastery of spatial psychology became apparent as the corridor narrowed, forcing the men to proceed single file. It was a trap not of violence, but of isolation. In the shadows, any sound of a footstep or whispered complaint was amplified, each subtle echo transforming into a warning of betrayal. The generals, trained to coordinate and command, found themselves unable to communicate freely. Their unity, once a source of strength, now worked against them, as small misunderstandings were magnified into perceived threats. Through hidden passages and cleverly angled mirrors, the Iron Maiden made each general witness the apparent duplicity of his companions. A reflection showed one general leaning toward another, whispering words he never spoke. Another saw movement behind a false door, imagining a spy from his own ranks. Every hallucination, every carefully manipulated perception forced the generals to question reality and, most devastatingly, to question each other. Trust, the foundation of their command, began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. As they advanced, the Iron Maiden introduced tactile cues, the floor slightly uneven, stones subtly shifted, a gentle vibration beneath their boots timed with the faint clang of a chain in the distance. Each sensation was a whisper of threat, a prompt for heightened vigilance. Their minds, already taxed by fear and disorientation, started to invent patterns, to project dangers where none existed. She was teaching them that human imagination, when pushed to the edge, can become more deadly than any army. She had also planted fragments of her own history throughout the gallery. Discarded scrolls, fragments of letters, sigils, and symbolic ornaments. Each object was a puzzle piece designed to provoke speculation and ignite latent fears. The generals debated among themselves what was authentic and what was part of a trap, each disagreement pulling them further apart. The Iron Maiden knew that by manipulating their interpretation of reality, she could control the pace of their unraveling without ever raising a weapon. By the time the corridor ended in a vaulted chamber, the generals were mentally exhausted. Their judgment impaired, they stumbled through the threshold with a false sense of courage, unaware that the Iron Maiden had already anticipated every reaction they could produce. Their previous experience on the battlefield, years of campaigns, sieges, and victories, offered no preparation for this new kind of warfare, one waged entirely in the mind. Here, every fear, every suspicion, and every misjudgment had been orchestrated into a perfect chain reaction that would lead them directly into her next stage. And while they struggled to comprehend what was real and what was illusion, the Iron Maiden remained a silent observer, noting each flaw in their reasoning, each psychological vulnerability, and each crack in their authority. Her power lay not in force, but in anticipation, in the cold calculation of human behavior and the precise timing of terror. This was no ordinary confrontation. It was a demonstration of dominance achieved through understanding and manipulation, an exhibition of how one mind could unmake 12 trained generals without lifting a sword. The vaulted chamber opened into a hall of mirrors, each pane distorted, twisting reflections into grotesque, shifting images. The generals froze, instinctively scanning their surroundings, and in that instant, the Iron Maiden struck the most subtle yet devastating blow. She fractured their perception of reality. Every movement seemed duplicated, every shadow a potential threat. What they thought they saw in one reflection contradicted what appeared in the next, and in their minds, certainty began to crumble. Confidence, the bedrock of command, had begun to erode. She had studied their psychology for months, understanding that men who command armies often rely on predictability, patterns, and the assumptions of loyalty. By destabilizing all three, she forced them to confront the terrifying possibility that even in a room full of allies, they were alone. The generals whispered accusations, low and frantic, each convinced that a companion was orchestrating betrayal. The Iron Maiden listened quietly from her hidden vantage point, cataloging every fear, every hesitation, every flaw in their reasoning. Her weapon was knowledge, and their vulnerability was the perfect conduit for its devastation. At the center of the hall, a large circular pedestal displayed a series of small, intricately carved figurines, each representing one of the 12 generals. On closer inspection, they realized that the positions of the figures corresponded eerily to the hall itself. the mirrors, the shadows, the angles, an exact miniature of the nightmare they now occupied. Their unease intensified. The Iron Maiden had not only mirrored their fears, but manipulated the environment to ensure that every step forward reinforced the illusion of inevitability. Movement became treacherous. Every glance provoked suspicion. Every gesture invited distrust. She introduced subtle auditory cues next, distant metallic echoes, the soft scrape of a hidden mechanism, a faint whisper that seemed to call a general's name from a shadowed corner. The mind, she knew, is quickest to attribute malice to ambiguity. And as the general's nerves frayed, their communication broke down further. Orders were questioned, advice ignored, decisions delayed. Cohesion, the one thing they had relied on to survive past campaigns, dissolved into paranoia, turning the 12 generals from a unit into 12 isolated actors trapped in a theater of their own fears. The Iron Maiden was patient. She allowed them to stumble, to debate, to misjudge, knowing that with each misstep they were unraveling exactly as intended. She introduced contradictions into the hall, mirrors showing paths that didn't exist, shadows suggesting invisible presences, and whispers that appeared to come from the walls themselves. Every attempt at rational thought collided with sensory evidence that made no sense, creating cognitive dissonance so profound that even experienced commanders questioned their own judgment. By the time they reached the far end of the hall, exhaustion had begun to take hold, yet their terror was only deepening. They believed they were navigating a trap of her creation, but in truth, the Iron Maiden had already guided them to a point where their greatest threat was themselves. Every fear, every assumption, every misjudgment had been manipulated to perfection. She had transformed a fortress into a psychological crucible, and the generals were the molten metal, reshaping under pressure they could neither anticipate nor escape. And as they hesitated at the final threshold, the Iron Maiden remained unseen, her presence felt in every reflection, every shadow, every echo. She had not needed violence. She had never needed it. The conquest of the mind, she knew, was far more absolute than the conquest of land, and it was only just beginning. The final threshold opened into the Hall of Judgment, a space unlike any other in the fortress. Shadows clung to the walls as though they had weight, and the flicker of torchlight made the columns appear alive, shifting, slightly with each heartbeat. The 12 generals, already fractured by fear, doubt, and isolation, now confronted the Iron Maiden's ultimate design. Here, she would transform hesitation into a weapon and uncertainty into chains stronger than iron. She had arranged the hall to magnify their insecurities. The floor was slightly uneven, forcing cautious steps. Faint gusts of air suggested the presence of unseen watchers, and the echoes of their own voices warped unnaturally, making every whisper seem louder, every accusation more dangerous. The generals, trained to command and coordinate, now moved with the precision of scared animals, each step betraying internal panic they tried desperately to conceal. One general, the eldest and most rigid, attempted to assert authority, issuing orders to his peers. His voice, however, returned to him distorted through the hall's acoustics, as if he were being mocked by an invisible chorus. Another general, haunted by past betrayals, swiveled, nervously, convinced that someone had plotted against him even before entering the fortress. Every glance over a shoulder became suspicion, every gesture a potential threat. The Iron Maiden had turned the room into a mirror for their inner fears, amplifying every hidden fault until cohesion was impossible. In the center of the hall stood a large platform with 12 small markers, each corresponding to a general. She had meticulously positioned them to subtly force them into certain paths, each step orchestrating their mistrust and splitting the group further. They were now puppets dancing to a rhythm only she could hear. While their eyes scanned for traps or ambushes, the real danger was invisible. the unraveling of their own command structures, the erosion of trust, the slow collapse of unity. And then she introduced the final element, a subtle illusion of movement in the peripheral shadows, something that could be seen but not touched. Each general reacted differently. Some froze, some whispered accusations, and some drew imaginary weapons, their instincts betrayed by imagination. The Iron Maiden watched from a hidden alcove, noting every micro-expression, every micro-gesture. Each reaction informed the next step she would take, the next subtle manipulation. She didn't need blood. Fear had become her most effective instrument. By the end of the night, the 12 generals were no longer the confident leaders who had entered the fortress. They were 12 fractured minds, each suspicious of the other, each convinced that survival depended on betrayal. The Iron Maiden had achieved what no army could, complete domination without a single strike. And yet, she had done more than deceive them. She had made them complicit in their own undoing, turning their ambition, fear, and pride against themselves in a psychological triumph that would echo far beyond the fortress walls. Now, you can imagine the impact of such a night. 12 generals, convinced of their superiority, completely undone by one woman's design. What would you do if you realized that your mind, rather than your enemies, was the battlefield? Leave a comment below sharing your reaction to the Iron Maiden's methods, because understanding her strategy is key to understanding the terrifying power of manipulation. Let me know what part shook you the most and join the conversation. This is the discussion history wants us to have. The dawn after the night in the Hall of Judgment was merciless. The generals emerged, or what remained of their unity, into a courtyard littered with the traces of their own fear. They had survived the illusions, the shadows, the whispered accusations, but they carried something far worse, the weight of having been deceived by a mind they had underestimated. Their confidence, once absolute, had been shattered, and the Iron Maiden's fortress now felt alive with memory, a place where every stone, every shadow, retained the echo of their doubts. She did not pursue them physically, nor did she need to. The chaos she had sown within had done the work for her. The generals moved like men in a fog, each questioning not only what they had seen, but whether their senses could ever be trusted again. What was real, and what was her design? Every step toward the outer walls forced them to confront the possibility that the Iron Maiden's control extended beyond the fortress itself, into the recesses of their own reasoning. The streets beyond the courtyard were empty, but she had anticipated their path. False tracks, misleading markers, and subtle cues planted days before ensured that even as the generals thought themselves in command, every choice they made was subtly guided. Each misstep furthered the division among them. A whispered rumor here, a discarded item there, planted to ignite suspicion among allies who had previously fought side by side. By the time they reached the gates, the 12 generals no longer formed a cohesive group. Their alliance was fractured, their plans compromised, their judgment clouded. She had also prepared her psychological aftermath. Observers hidden in the city, carefully chosen informants, and messages designed to spread confusion among the ranks ensured that news of the general's failure would ripple outward, magnifying the impact of her deception. The Iron Maiden understood that victory was as much about perception as reality. By the time word reached their armies, the story was already rewritten. The generals had been bested by an enemy that seemed omnipresent, omniscient, and invincible. Inside the fortress, she reviewed her designs silently. Nothing had been wasted. The hallways, the shadows, the mirrors, the auditory cues, all had contributed to the same outcome. 12 commanders reduced to uncertainty, fear, and distrust. And though she had not touched a single soldier, she had dismantled an entire command structure, leaving their forces leaderless and their morale shattered. The Iron Maiden knew the true power of psychological warfare was patience. She had taken years to gather intelligence, understand her enemies, and craft a scenario where their own minds became the instruments of their defeat. Every illusion, every reflection, every whispered doubt was a calculated stroke, and the generals had unknowingly painted themselves into a corner from which there was no escape. As the sun rose, the fortress seemed to breathe again, quiet and empty, except for her presence. Outside, the general's forces awaited direction that would never come, and the city's population, untouched by battle yet deeply affected by rumor, began to understand that a single mind had altered the course of events. The Iron Maiden had not only survived the night, she had rewritten history without a single drop of blood. And while the generals carried their humiliation forward, she had already begun preparing her next move, ensuring that the ripples of that night would be felt far beyond the walls she commanded. In the days that followed, the legend of that night began to spread, though not through official records. Those had been carefully altered or destroyed. Instead, whispers traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants, servants, and couriers who had glimpsed fragments of the Iron Maiden's fortress. Stories of generals undone by shadows, mirrors, and whispered doubts became the foundation of her reputation. In some accounts, the generals were described as having vanished entirely, swallowed by the night itself, though in truth, they wandered back into their own armies, shattered and questioning every decision they had ever made. The Iron Maiden understood the potency of narrative as a weapon almost as well as the mechanics of fear. She ensured that no two accounts of the night were identical, seeding confusion among those who would report it. Some described elaborate traps, others mentioned spirits or curses, and some even claimed she had walked through walls, unseen and untouchable. The generals themselves could not agree on what had truly occurred, and the dissonance among them amplified the effectiveness of her tactics. By controlling perception, she controlled the story, and by controlling the story, she controlled the legacy of that night. Meanwhile, within the fortress, she meticulously documented every observation, every reaction, every subtle crack in the general's resolve. Her notebooks, filled with diagrams of mirrors, shadows, and corridors, became a repository of human behavior under extreme psychological stress. She analyzed which illusions produced panic, which auditory cues created suspicion, and which manipulations led to the fracturing of alliances. In essence, the Iron Maiden had converted the fortress into a laboratory for understanding the mechanics of fear and the architecture of doubt. Those who had encountered her began to whisper of rituals that accompanied her strategy. Candles lit in hidden patterns, sigils etched into the walls, and faint inscriptions in forgotten tongues were said to enhance the effect of her illusions. While some dismissed these claims as superstition, the outcomes were undeniable. Generals trained in warfare, seasoned in campaigns, and confident in their command had been undone by elements that could not be measured by sword or spear. Their own minds had become their captor, and the Iron Maiden was the invisible hand guiding them toward collapse. Her influence extended beyond the walls. News of the general's failure emboldened her allies and intimidated her enemies. Neighboring rulers and commanders, hearing fragmented accounts, often overestimated the reach of her power, believing she commanded forces and abilities far beyond reality. This perception amplified her strategic advantage, allowing her to maneuver with minimal opposition. Psychological dominance had become her most potent tool, eclipsing conventional military might. Even decades later, secret texts and oral histories preserved fragments of her methods. Cults and societies whispered about her techniques, teaching successors that influence, patience, and perception could be more destructive than any army. The Iron Maiden's legacy endured not through monuments or triumphal arches, but through the subtle, enduring terror she instilled in those who dared underestimate her intellect and her foresight. She had demonstrated that the mind, once fully understood and manipulated, could be more vulnerable than any fortress wall or battlefield formation. And though the generals survived physically, their reputations and cohesion had been irreparably shattered. The Iron Maiden had achieved what few rulers in history ever could. She had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that psychological mastery could triumph over brute force. Her story persisted, whispered in secrecy and encoded in fragmentary texts, ensuring that the memory of her ingenuity and the consequences for those who challenged her would not be forgotten. The Iron Maiden's fortress had returned to silence, yet the echoes of that night persisted far beyond its walls. 12 generals, once confident and invincible, now carried with them the residue of fear, doubt, and fractured trust. Every step they took outside the fortress reminded them of the illusions they could not escape, the whispers they could not ignore, and the knowledge that a single mind had undone their combined might. History would record their campaigns, yet few would dare document the psychological theater orchestrated by a woman who understood that dominance was achieved not through blades, but through control of perception. Across the region, her reputation became a cautionary tale. Leaders, warriors, and strategists whispered her name in hushed tones, debating whether her tactics were supernatural, ingenious, or both. Those who had glimpsed her fortress described corridors that shifted, reflections that misled, and shadows that seemed to watch and anticipate every movement. Others spoke of her mastery over human psychology, claiming she could turn loyalty into betrayal and courage into hesitation. The Iron Maiden had created a paradigm that transcended traditional warfare, a battlefield where thought and fear were weapons more powerful than any army. Even the surviving generals returned to their homelands changed men. Their forces were disorganized, their strategies questioned, and their reputations tarnished by failure they could neither fully explain nor admit. The Iron Maiden had not only won a single night, she had reshaped the political landscape, demonstrating that a ruler who understands the fragility of the mind can dismantle empires without spilling a drop of blood. Her brilliance was in the subtlety, in the orchestration of every sound, reflection, and perception, so that her adversaries dismantled themselves. Over the decades, scholars and secret societies sought to preserve fragments of her methods. Manuscripts hinted at patterns, inscriptions, and rituals used to manipulate fear and perception. Oral traditions preserved the lessons for those bold enough to study them. Leaders who applied even partial understanding of her techniques gained advantage in conflicts where sheer force might have failed. The Iron Maiden became more than a historical figure. She became an archetype of psychological warfare, a blueprint for the understanding that control over minds could determine the outcome of wars, long before swords were drawn. Her story serves as a reminder that power is often unseen. While armies march and fortresses stand, the true battlefield is inside the mind, where fear, doubt, and perception dictate decisions more decisively than any weapon. The Iron Maiden demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and insight could achieve victory far beyond conventional expectations. Those who underestimate subtlety, cunning, and mental mastery risk collapse at the hands of a strategist who observes, manipulates, and anticipates every move. If you've followed the journey of the Iron Maiden, take a moment to reflect on what her mastery reveals about power, strategy, and human psychology. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, whether it shocked you, fascinated you, or made you reconsider how decisions and perception shape history. Don't forget to like the video if you found value in uncovering these hidden tactics, and check that you're subscribed so you can continue exploring stories of figures who rewrote the rules of power. There's always more to uncover, and the lessons of one night in her fortress still resonate today.